move on to our next speaker. There's still time for questions at the end.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Anyone that has questions, we'll have plenty of time at the end. Our final speaker is Mike Graybill. Mike is a retired director of the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. And the title of his talk is, "We Have to Shake Our Fossil Fuel Energy Habit. Is Floating Offshore Wind in Oregon the Best Solution?" Mike.
Unmute.
Okay, we can hear you now, Mike.
Okay, so my name is Mike Graybill. I live in Coos Bay, and I've lived here since the prior century, since the mid 1970s. My presentation today, let me just see if I can get it going here. Okay, how do I get this? All right. My presentation today is going to walk you through and remind you that floating offshore wind, can you see my cursor?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, floating offshore wind is one type of renewable energy, but that's going to be the focus of this discussion. There are other types of wind energy, and there are other types of renewable energy that should be considered in the mix as we chase away from fossil fuels. Further, this is going to drill in on the Oregon offshore wind discussion. Clearly, the offshore wind discussion also takes place throughout planet Earth. And then we'll move, but the primary focus of my discussion is just to give people in this group that are participating here today an understanding of what is actually physically involved and what might come from that. So the part that I won't be able to get to is how to compare the types of renewable energy from one to the other. As we move away from fossil energy, that's will be reserved for another discussion. But hopefully you will understand what offshore wind floating offshore wind involves, so you can make your own comparisons. It's been mentioned earlier, but there's two processes that are driving this discussion. The legislation at the state level that's required the Department of Energy to look at 3 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, as well as the presidential executive order that is 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in America by 2030. It's mentioned earlier that this process is being run at the federal level by this Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. The sole mission of that agency is to issue leases in federal waters of the outer continental shelf. Some of you who have been around for a while may recognize the term Minerals Management Service. That's the former name of this agency before the Deepwater Horizon oil spill revealed management problems with the agency. There's the call areas. They're 2,000 square miles. The target is for BOEM in the first quarter of 2024 to issue leases within these call areas to produce 3 gigawatts of electricity. So I think it's important to say, how much is 3 gigawatts? As a primer for people who might be conservation oriented but not engineering oriented, a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and a megawatt is 1,000,000 kilowatt. Well, it's 1,000 kilowatts, but a gigawatt is 1,000,000 kilowatts. So 3 gigawatts, for example, is 3,000 megawatts. Turbines, wind turbines produce somewhere between 2 and 15 megawatts apiece. So they put them together in wind farms, and wind farms have hundreds of turbines that produce anywhere from hundreds of megawatts of power to gigawatts of power. Just for example, the Bonneville Dam produces 1.2 gigawatts. So we're talking about 3 times the size amount of electricity as the Bonneville Dam. We should hopefully know by now that a wind turbine is an electrical generator that's attached to a propeller. The wind turns the propeller and electricity is produced. Right now, there's over 70,000 wind turbines operating in the United States. Almost all of them are on land, but the turbines that are being developed for offshore are big and getting bigger. So, for example, these turbines weigh hundreds of tons apiece. So I'm going to walk you through the different types of wind energy. There's two kinds of bottom-mounted wind energy. One is onshore and the other one is offshore. This is where the towers of the wind turbines are attached to the ground. Right now, there's over 1,000 wind farms in the United States. This is an example of one. I think when people think of wind energy, hopefully all Oregonians have been up the Columbia Gorge and have seen all those big wind turbines. Those are small turbines, about 2 megawatts each. They've been around for a while, and a 450 megawatt facility takes about 39 square miles to generate that power. The next kind of offshore wind is bottom-mounted offshore wind. So it's, in large measure, it's the same as onshore wind. The turbines tend to be bigger. These are 5 megawatts, so they're twice as big as those ones in the Columbia Gorge. And they need more complicated foundations. And this one is one of the German offshore winds. They're in shallow water that's 100 feet deep or 40 meters deep, much shallower than the wind call areas in Oregon. And they involve very elaborate steel structures. And this is an example of one that has just this facility that generates 350 megawatts of power. So that is much smaller than the 3 gigawatts of power that we're discussing. So now we'll move to floating offshore wind. Now the foundation is no longer attached to the bottom. So you have a floating foundation that then has to be anchored or attached to the bottom by mooring lines. And then the electric power lines that come off of the turbines move within the array of turbines to a floating substation where it's conditioned and put into a central cable that is the export cable that goes to the onshore area where it is conditioned again and sent to the grid. Floating offshore wind is a completely new and still prototype scale operation. The earliest history only dates to like 2009. Right now, in contrast to there being over 1,000 onshore wind turbines, there's now turbine farms. There's now only 16 projects as of 2019. So here's what one looks like. There's the tower, the nacelle with the generator in it, the blades. But here's the example of the foundation that is most commonly used, called a semi-submersible foundation. Well, so I'll walk you through the parts of these components. Here's what one of the generators looks like for a commonly produced offshore wind turbine. It produces 12 megawatts of power, and by the time you put blades on it and set it on top of the tower, it weighs nearly 2,000 tons. But that's just for a single tower. You would need 250 of these units, these 12 megawatt units, to produce 3 gigawatts of power. So you can take these things out there, but you have to mount them on a foundation. The tower and the propellers or the blades and the generator are the thing that generate the power. All the rest of this stuff is called the balance of the system. That's the floating structures, the mooring systems to hold the floating structures in place, the cables that connect the turbines to the substation itself, and then the cable that goes to land. So we'll go through piece by piece. Here's what one of the floating foundations looks like for the Wind Float Atlantic project off the coast of Portugal. There's 3 turbines there, and they have 8.4 megawatt turbines on them. They're currently, the one I showed you before was 12, and each one of these platforms is anchored with 3 catenary anchoring systems. Here's wind float 1 being towed out to sea, and you can kind of see the scale of what's involved. Here's what the mooring system looks like for a single tower or a single turbine. You have a mooring line that goes and attaches to a chain that then attaches to an anchor. Mooring lines are at least 4 times longer than the depth of the water. And here's an illustration that shows what one of the mooring lines looked like. So I did a quick calculation. Here's an example here where it shows, this reference shows that the length of the mooring line should be between 4 and 8 times the water depth. I did a calculation for 650 meters of water, which is a typical depth in these call areas, and did it a mooring cable length of 3 times the length, and then did 3 mooring cables and anchors per turbine assembly, because there's 3 lines on each one of the foundations, times 215 megawatt turbine assembles. That means that a 3 gigawatt wind farm off the Oregon coast will need 600 anchors attached to 727 miles of line.
Okay, and Mike, 5 minutes.
Yep. Here's what one of those 600 anchors would look like. Here's the ship that's required to deploy deploy those anchors. Here's what the rope looks like that is attached to the chain. Again, we'll need 600 miles or 700 miles of rope. 600 of these rope systems will be hanging between the towers and the ocean bottom. Once the tower's in place, there's an electrical cable that comes from it in what's called an inter-array cable. That's copper, and it's the cable that carries the electricity. The copper line is not strong enough, so they have to put flotation on the inter-array cables so that they can compensate for the movement of the towers. Here's what an array looks like for 50 turbines. And this is the setup for the inter-array cabling for the electrical cables that go through there. Of course, a 3 gigawatt array would need 200 turbines. This is the array for 50 turbines, so you would be looking at 4 times more than that. The cabling in the array amounts to hundreds of miles. Here's what the ship looks like that is deploying cable in the Dogger Bank. There's how much cable they used for this one off the coast of the east coast of England. That's a 1.3 gigawatt facility. They use 155 miles of cable. They're in shallow water at 30 meters. We're in 100 or 600 meters, so you're going to need more cable to get from top to bottom. So it's easy to say that there would be 350 miles of conducting cable within the array to connect to the substation. I couldn't find a good picture of a floating substation because there aren't that many of them. But this is an example of a substation that's in a wind farm off of Germany. This particular wind substation weighs 8,500 tons. It was earlier mentioned, what would the coastal impacts be? Ports are going to be necessary to build and support and launch these things. There's a whole list of activities that ports must accomplish, or that would be port-related activities. Here's an example of what one of the marshaling and fabrication facilities look like, but not all ports have the same capabilities. So there's examples where some ports would just be involved once the turbine assembly is operational. There's some ports that may have the capability of actually fabricating the components, building those giant generators, fabricating the towers, There's others that might be able to take those components and put them together. They require 5,000-ton cranes to lift these 850-ton generators on top of the towers. So those are some examples of port requirements. And here's an example of just what one port looks like that is assembling the floating foundations. Out here in the distance, you can see the floating, the individual legs of a three-legged floating foundation. So I just thought that that would give you a sense of what's physically involved in the process, and I'll leave it there. And I'll leave a discussion of comparing it to other wind forms for another time.
Mike, thank you. That was excellent. We can open it up